Cop slapped a single-dad veteran in court seconds later. He took the judge's seat. But what nobody saw coming was how the man they tried to humiliate would end up holding their fate in his hands. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across Jim Walker's worn linoleum floor. His hands moved automatically, cracking eggs into a bowl while his mind wandered to the courthouse, hearing that loomed ahead. The gentle sizzle of butter in the pan couldn't quite drown out his worried thoughts. Jim glanced at the carefully folded American flag displayed on the shelf above the kitchen window. Sarah had always kept it so pristine, dusting it weekly. Since her passing, he'd maintained that same routine, though some mornings like this one, the sight of it made his chest tighten. "Daddy, you're going to burn them again," Lily's voice chirped from behind him. Jim blinked, quickly turning his attention back to the eggs. "Not this time, sweetie." He managed a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. The spatula moved through the yellow mixture, creating soft, fluffy curds. "Gotta make sure you have a proper breakfast before school." Lily climbed onto her usual chair at the small kitchen table, her backpack already packed and waiting by the door. Her dark hair was pulled back in slightly uneven pigtails, his best attempt at morning hair duty. "I can make my own breakfast, you know. I'm 10 now." "I know you can," Jim said softly, sliding the eggs onto 2 plates. "But this is our thing, right? Our morning together?" The toast popped up, making them both jump a little. Jim tried to hide his reaction, but his daughter noticed. She always noticed. These days, sudden noises still triggered memories he'd rather forget: explosions, gunfire, the screech of metal. He took a deep breath, centering himself the way his counselor had taught him. "Here we go," he said, placing Lily's plate in front of her. "Eggs a la Walker, with extra pepper just like Mom used to make," Lily added, her fork already diving in. She looked up at him, her green eyes, Sarah's eyes full of understanding beyond her years. "You didn't sleep much last night, did you?" Jim sat down across from her, his own plate untouched. "That obvious, huh? You've got those dark circles Mom used to call your raccoon eyes." Lily took another bite, then reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You'll do fine, Daddy." Her small fingers were warm against his, and for a moment, Jim felt his anxiety ease. Here was the truth of his life, not in the accusations of that bitter neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who'd filed the neglect complaint after seeing Lily playing alone in their fenced backyard. The truth was in these quiet morning moments, in the careful routine he'd built for them both. "Eat your breakfast," he said gently, finally picking up his own fork. "Bus will be here in 20 minutes. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clock ticking on the wall and the occasional scrape of forks against plates. Jim found himself studying their kitchen, the slightly chipped paint on the cabinets he kept meaning to fix, the collection of Lily's art projects magnetized to the refrigerator, the small herb garden Sarah had started on the windowsill that he somehow managed to keep alive. It wasn't much, but it was home. The thought of losing any of this because of false accusations made his stomach churn. "I packed my lunch already," Lily announced, carrying her empty plate to the sink. She had to stretch to reach the faucet, but insisted on rinsing it herself. "And I did all my homework last night, and my gym clothes are clean for PE today." Jim recognized what she was doing, proving their life was organized, normal, safe. His heart swelled with love and pride, even as it ached that his 10-year-old felt she needed to defend their family. "You're pretty amazing, you know that?" he said, standing to help her dry the dishes. "Mom always said I got that from you." Lily handed him a wet plate. "She said you were amazing too, even when you didn't believe it." Jim's throat tightened. He set the dried plate in the rack, then knelt down to Lily's level, looking her in the eye. "Your mom was the amazing one. She'd be so proud of you, Lily Pad." "She'd be proud of you too, Daddy." Lily wrapped her arms around his neck, hugging him tight. "You're doing a good job, no matter what Mrs. Henderson says." The sound of the school bus's brakes squealing at the corner broke their embrace. Lily grabbed her backpack, then paused at the door. "Promise you'll tell me everything when you pick me up from Mrs. Garcia's after court?" "Promise," Jim said, helping her adjust her backpack straps. "Every detail." He watched from the front step as Lily climbed aboard the bus, waving until it disappeared around the corner. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. Jim allowed himself one more moment of peace before heading inside to change for court. His dress clothes felt stiff and foreign after so many months in work pants and t-shirts. The tie gave him trouble. Sarah had always done it for him, even after he left the service. Finally, he managed a passable knot, though it felt like it was choking him. Jim gathered the stack of documents he'd prepared, school records showing Lily's perfect attendance, testimonials from teachers about her well-adjusted behavior, even photos of their neat home and well-stocked kitchen. He'd spent weeks building his case, determined to prove that a single father, even one with his challenges, could provide a stable home. The drive to Mrs. Garcia's house was short but heavy with tension. His elderly neighbor had been a godsend since Sarah's passing, always willing to watch Lily when needed. She opened her door before he could knock, her kind face creased with concern. "Mihijo," she said softly, pulling him into a quick hug. "Don't worry so much. The truth will speak for itself." "Thank you for watching her," Jim managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Lily is a joy, you know this." Mrs. Garcia patted his arm. "Now go. Show them what kind of father you really are." Jim nodded, not trusting himself to speak again. He walked back to his car, each step feeling heavier than the last. The courthouse waited downtown, its stone facade already visible in the distance. As he pulled away from the curb, he caught a glimpse of Lily's lunch bag on the back seat. She'd forgotten it in her rush to catch the bus. It was such a normal thing, such a small detail of their life together. But in that moment, it represented everything he was fighting for: the right to keep making her lunches, to keep helping with homework, to keep being her father. Jim gripped the steering wheel tighter and pointed his car toward the courthouse. Whatever happened today, he would face it with the same courage and dignity Sarah had always believed he possessed. He owed that much to both his girls, the one watching over them from above, and the one counting on him to come home victorious. The courthouse loomed before Jim Walker like a mountain of stone and judgment. Its weathered steps, worn smooth by countless footsteps, led up to heavy wooden doors that seemed ready to swallow him whole. He tugged at his tie, the only one he owned, and straightened his jacket, a remnant from better days that now hung a bit loose on his frame. Inside, the courthouse hallway buzzed with activity. Lawyers in crisp suits rushed past, their leather briefcases swinging. Court clerks shuffled stacks of papers. The air held that distinct mix of furniture, polish, and anxiety that seemed unique to places where lives changed with the bang of a gavel. Jim's worn dress shoes squeaked against the polished floor as he approached courtroom C. His palms were damp, and his heart thumped so loud he wondered if others could hear it. The false neglect accusation from his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had been eating at him for weeks. How could anyone think he'd neglect Lily? She was all he had left. The courtroom doors groaned as he pushed them open. The space inside was packed much fuller than he'd expected for what should have been a routine morning hearing. Rows of wooden benches stretched back, filled with other parents, lawyers, and what looked like casual observers. Their quiet conversations created a constant murmur that reminded Jim of the mess hall back in his service days. As he made his way down the center aisle, a uniformed officer near the front caught his eye. The officer's face twisted into something between a smirk and a scowl as Jim approached. "Well, well," the officer said, loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "If it isn't the hero." He grabbed a thick manila folder from the desk beside him and slapped it against Jim's chest, hard enough to make him stumble back a step. "Here's your file, soldier boy. Try not to lose it like you lost everything else." The folder's impact felt like a physical blow. Several people in the gallery chuckled, the sound cutting through Jim like shrapnel. His ears burned hot, and he clutched the folder tight, knuckles white against the manila paper. "Thank you, officer," Jim managed to say, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. The military had taught him how to keep his composure, even when everything inside screamed for reaction. He found an empty spot on a bench near the front, doing his best to ignore the whispers that followed him. But their words reached his ears anyway, sharp and clear in the acoustic chamber of the courtroom. "Another deadbeat dad. Probably thinks his service record will save him. Did you hear about his wife?" No wonder. Jim focused on breathing, slow and steady, just like he'd learned in training. He opened the folder, though the words swam before his eyes. The flag pin on his lapel, Sarah's last gift to him, felt heavier than usual. A young mother sitting nearby scooted further away from him, pulling her purse closer as if he might snatch it. The action wasn't lost on those around them, drawing more knowing looks and whispers. Jim's jaw clenched tight enough to ache, but he kept his eyes forward, fixed on the empty judge's bench. The courtroom clock ticked loudly in the humid air, each second stretching like taffy. Jim's thoughts drifted to Lily, probably sitting in her classroom right now, working on multiplication tables or reading about pioneers. She'd hugged him extra tight this morning as if she knew how much he needed it. "You'll do fine, Daddy," she'd said, with all the confidence of a 10-year-old who still believed her father could fix anything. The bailiff's voice suddenly cut through the murmur of the courtroom. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Harold Bennett presiding." The scratch of wooden benches and rustling clothes filled the air as everyone stood. Judge Bennett entered from his chambers, his black robe flowing behind him like a shadow. His face, lined with age and experience, revealed nothing as he took his seat. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying authority without needing to be loud. Jim sank back onto the hard bench, his folder clutched in trembling hands. The judge shuffled through some papers, adjusted his reading glasses, and then looked up at the gathered crowd. "James Walker," Judge Bennett called out, his tone neutral but firm. Jim's legs felt like lead as he stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "Step forward, please." The walk to the podium seemed to take forever. Each step echoed in Jim's ears, accompanied by the rustle of turning heads and the weight of dozens of staring eyes. He could feel the officer's smirk burning into his back, could practically hear the thoughts of everyone watching. Here goes another failure. Another disappointment. Another dad who couldn't keep it together. Jim reached the podium and gripped its edges, the wood smooth and cool against his palms. Judge Bennett looked down at him over the rims of his glasses, his expression unreadable. The American flag behind the judge's bench caught Jim's eye, identical to the one he kept so carefully dusted at home. He thought of Sarah, of how proud she'd been when he'd earned his service medals. He thought of Lily, who deserved so much more than what he could give her. He thought of Mrs. Patterson next door, watching his every move, waiting for him to fail. The silence stretched thin as Judge Bennett studied him, the weight of judgment hanging in the air like storm clouds ready to break. Judge Harold Bennett leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the bench. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his lined face as he studied Jim Walker with piercing eyes that had seen decades of truth and lies parade before them. "Mr. Walker," the judge's deep voice carried across the now silent courtroom, "before we proceed further, I'd like to hear from you directly." He paused, adjusting his reading glasses. "Tell me, what do honor and responsibility mean to you?" Jim's throat tightened. He stood straighter, his military bearing taking over despite his worn suit and tired eyes. The question transported him back through years of memories, some proud, some painful, all defining. "Your Honor," Jim began, his voice quiet but steady, "I learned about honor in the military, but I truly understood it through my late wife, Sarah." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. "She fought cancer with more courage than I ever showed in combat. Even in her final days, she made me promise to raise Lily with the same strength she showed to teach our daughter that doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy." Judge Bennett nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. "Responsibility." Jim's voice caught for a moment as he thought of Lily's smile that morning. "It's getting up every day at 5 a.m. to make breakfast, even when you're bone-tired. It's checking homework and attending parent-teacher conferences. It's explaining to your 10-year-old why mommy isn't coming home, then holding her while she cries." His hands gripped the podium tighter. "It's working 2 jobs and still finding time to read bedtime stories because that's what your child needs." The fluorescent lights hummed in the silence that followed. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled on her keyboard. "Some folks," Jim continued, his voice growing stronger, "they look at a single father and see what's missing. But being responsible means focusing on what's there. The love, the commitment, the determination to give your child the best life possible, no matter what anyone else thinks." Mrs. Patterson, his accuser, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The officer who had mocked him earlier stared at his own shoes. "Honor and responsibility aren't just words to me, Your Honor. They're promises I made to my country, to my wife, and most importantly, to my daughter. I may not be perfect, but every decision I make with Lily's well-being in my heart." Judge Bennett removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully with his handkerchief. The silence in the courtroom was absolute now, heavy with the weight of Jim's words. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. "Mr. Walker," the judge said finally, replacing his glasses, "I've sat on this bench for 32 years. I've heard countless explanations, excuses, and justifications. He picked up his gavel, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. But rarely have I heard such genuine truth. The judge's next words cut through the tension like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. The petition for removal of custody is denied. Lily Walker will remain in the care of her father. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Patterson's mouth fell open in shock, while her attorney frantically shuffled through papers. Furthermore, Judge Bennett continued, I find these allegations of neglect to be wholly without merit. Mr. Walker has demonstrated not just adequate, but exemplary dedication to his daughter's well-being. Jim's legs felt weak with relief. He steadied himself against the podium, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck with finality. As the courtroom began to empty, Jim gathered his paperwork with trembling hands. A few people patted his shoulder as they passed, murmuring words of congratulation. The officer who had mocked him earlier slipped out a side door, avoiding eye contact. Outside the courthouse, Jim stood on the broad stone steps, blinking in the bright sunlight. The spring air carried the scent of newly bloomed flowers from the courthouse gardens, but he barely noticed. The emotional weight of the morning crashed over him like a wave. Tears welled in his eyes as he thought of Sarah, wishing she could have heard him speak about her courage. He thought of Lily, waiting at the neighbor's house, probably worried sick about what was happening. His shoulders shook slightly as he allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel everything he'd been holding back. The fear, the relief, the grief, the triumph. A gentle breeze dried the tears on his cheeks as he stood there, briefcase in hand, the courthouse doors closing behind him. He had done it. Lily was safe. They would go home together. Jim Walker stepped out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, his heart still racing from the morning's events. The concrete steps felt solid under his feet, a welcome change from the shakiness he'd felt inside. He loosened his tie, letting out a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of the past few hours. Mr. Walker. A woman's voice called from behind him. Could I have a moment? Jim turned to see a young woman in a navy blue suit hurrying down the courthouse steps. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days. She reached his level, slightly out of breath. I'm Maria Alvarez, she said, extending her hand. I was in court during your hearing. Jim shook her hand, noting her firm grip. Nice to meet you, Miss Alvarez. Please, call me Maria. She glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. I wanted to tell you how moved I was by what you said in there. About honor and responsibility. We don't hear enough of that in these halls anymore. Jim shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. I just spoke the truth, ma'am. That's exactly what I mean. Maria's brown eyes lit up with intensity. Do you know how rare that is here? To have someone speak from the heart instead of reciting what their expensive lawyer told them to say. A group of attorneys walked past them, their leather shoes clicking against the pavement. Maria waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. Look, I'm a public defender. I see dozens of cases every week, and I've started to notice patterns. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a business card. Things that don't add up, cases that get fast-tracked or buried depending on who's involved. Jim took the card, studying the simple black text. What are you saying? I'm saying that this courthouse needs more people like you, Mr. Walker. People who understand real integrity. She glanced at her watch. I have another hearing in 10 minutes, but I'd like to talk more. Maybe over coffee sometime? Jim pocketed the card, shaking his head. Look, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm just trying to take care of my daughter. I'm not looking to get involved in anything. I understand, Maria cut in gently. But sometimes doing the right thing means getting involved. Think about it. She gave him a knowing look. The system works better when good people are part of it. As Maria turned to head back inside, Jim called after her. Why me? You don't even know me. She paused on the steps. I saw how that officer treated you today. Most people would have gotten angry, fought back, but you stayed dignified. That tells me everything I need to know. With that, she disappeared through the heavy courthouse doors. Jim stood there for a moment, Maria's words echoing in his mind. The card felt heavy in his pocket, like it carried more weight than just paper should. He walked to his old pickup truck, parked in the far corner of the lot where the paint was peeling off the parking space lines. Inside the truck, He sat for a minute with his hands on the steering wheel. The afternoon sun warmed the cab, reminding him of summer days when Sarah was still alive, when they'd take long drives with the windows down. She would have known what to make of Maria's words. Sarah always had a way of seeing through to the heart of things. He started the engine, the familiar rumble bringing him back to the present. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his eyes caught the courthouse in his rearview mirror, tall and imposing against the blue sky. Maria's words kept playing in his head. The system works better when good people are part of it. Jim shook his head, trying to focus on what mattered right now. He had to pick up Lily from Mrs. Chen's house. His daughter would want to know everything about the hearing, and he'd have to find the right words to explain it all to her. Maybe they could order pizza tonight, a little celebration that things had worked out okay. The streets were busy with afternoon traffic as he made his way through town. He passed the elementary school where Lily spent her days, the small park where she loved to play, the grocery store where they did their Sunday shopping together. This was his world. Simple, manageable, enough. He didn't need to get tangled up in courthouse politics or corruption investigations. But as he stopped at a red light, his hand unconsciously touched the business card in his pocket. He thought about the officer who had humiliated him, about the whispers of deadbeat dad in the courtroom. How many other parents had faced the same treatment? How many didn't get a judge who would listen to their side of the story? The light turned green, and Jim turned onto his street. Mrs. Chen's house was just ahead, its neat garden boxes full of spring flowers. He could see Lily's backpack on the front porch. She always left it there when she played in Mrs. Chen's backyard. Jim parked the truck and took a deep breath. Right now, none of the big questions mattered. What mattered was having dinner with his daughter, hearing about her day, making sure she felt safe and loved. He would tuck Maria's card away in his desk drawer at home. Whatever she thought she saw in him, whatever battles she wanted to fight, they would have to wait. He got out of the truck, already hearing Lily's laughter from the backyard. The sound lifted his spirits, pushing away the heaviness of the morning. Tonight would be about celebration, just father and daughter, pizza, and maybe some ice cream. Tomorrow could take care of itself. The kitchen in the Walker home glowed with warm yellow light as the sun began to set outside. The familiar scent of spaghetti sauce simmered on the stove, filling the modest space with a comforting aroma. Lily moved around their small kitchen table with careful determination, setting down each plate and fork with precision. Her dark hair was still slightly damp from her after-school shower, pulled back in a neat ponytail that swung with each movement. "Daddy, does this mean we're safe now?" Lily asked, placing the last fork beside Jim's plate. Her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, searched his face with a maturity beyond her 10 years. Jim paused in stirring the sauce, his hand tightening briefly around the wooden spoon. He turned to face his daughter, choosing his words carefully. "The judge made a good decision today, sweetheart. That's what matters right now. But Mrs. Peterson won't try to cause trouble anymore?" Lily pressed, referring to their neighbor who had filed the complaint. Jim crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and placed his hands gently on Lily's shoulders. "Hey now, remember what we always say about worrying?" A small smile tugged at Lily's lips. "Worry is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do," Jim continued, "but doesn't get you anywhere." They finished together, and Lily giggled. Jim pulled her into a quick hug, breathing in the fresh scent of her strawberry shampoo. "That's my girl. Now, how about you help me with these meatballs?" Lily's face lit up. "Can I roll them this time? You always make them too big." "Too big?" Jim placed a hand over his heart in mock offense. "I'll have you know, those are perfectly regulation-sized meatballs, young lady. Daddy, there's no such thing as regulation meatballs." Lily dissolved into laughter, and Jim couldn't help joining in. They worked together at the counter, Lily carefully rolling small, even meatballs, while Jim added the final touches to the sauce. The kitchen filled with the sounds of their comfortable chatter and the soft bubbling of the pot on the stove. "Remember that time you tried to make meatballs with cereal instead of breadcrumbs?" Lily asked, her nose scrunching at the memory. Jim chuckled, shaking his head. "That wasn't my finest culinary moment. Your mom would have never let me live that down." Instead of the usual sadness that accompanied mentions of Sarah, Jim felt a warm glow of remembrance. Lily smiled too, rolling another perfect meatball between her palms. "Mom always said you were hopeless in the kitchen," she said softly, but her tone was fond. "She wasn't wrong," Jim admitted. But look at us now. Master chefs in the making. They sat down to eat once everything was ready. The small table set with their everyday plates and the checkered placemats Lily had picked out last summer. The meatballs were slightly uneven, some of Jim's larger ones mixed with Lily's more modest portions. But neither of them minded. "Did you finish your math homework?" Jim asked, twirling spaghetti around his fork. "Most of it. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me during study period." Lily took a bite of meatball. "These are really good, Daddy. Even the big ones." Jim laughed, reaching over to tap her nose with his napkin. "Thank you for your generous approval of my non-regulation meatballs." They traded stories about their day, carefully skating around the morning's court appearance. Lily told him about the science project she was working on with her best friend Emma, and how they were planning to grow crystals. Jim listened intently, asking questions and marveling at her enthusiasm. For a moment, sitting there in their warm kitchen with the dishes clinking and Lily's animated chatter filling the air, Jim felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't perfect. The chairs were mismatched, the paint on the walls was showing its age, and bills were still piled up on the counter, but it was theirs. Later that night, after helping Lily with the last of her homework and tucking her into bed, Jim stood at the kitchen window. The neighborhood was quiet, most windows dark except for the occasional blue flicker of a television. He dried the last plate from dinner, his movements automatic as his mind wandered back to the courthouse steps and Maria Alvarez's words. "The kind of man this place needs," she had said. Jim set the dish towel down and leaned against the counter, staring out at the darkness. What had she meant about corruption in the court system? He'd seen enough in his military days to know that systems could be broken. But he'd wanted to believe that here, at home, things were different. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the silence. Through the thin walls, he could hear Lily's soft breathing from her bedroom. Jim rubbed his face, feeling the day's stubble under his palms. Maria's business card sat on the counter where he'd tossed it earlier, its corners slightly bent. Her earnest expression and determined words played through his mind again. "You have integrity, Mr. Walker. That's rare around here." The wind rustled through the trees outside, casting moving shadows across the kitchen floor. Jim watched them dance, his thoughts turning over Maria's cryptic warnings and the strange events of the day. In the distance, a car alarm briefly sounded and fell silent, leaving him alone with his thoughts in the quiet kitchen. Jim Walker stepped through the courthouse's heavy oak doors early the next morning, his shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. Though yesterday's victory had lifted some weight from his shoulders, anxiety still churned in his stomach. The follow-up hearing was meant to be routine, just finalizing the paperwork from yesterday's ruling. The familiar musty scent of old law books and wood polish filled his nostrils as he made his way down the corridor. A few early morning rays streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in their golden beams. Jim straightened his tie, wishing he had a better suit than this navy one he'd worn to too many funerals. The courtroom was already half full when he entered. He recognized several faces from yesterday, the same clerk shuffling papers, the same bailiff standing guard. Judge Harold Bennett sat at the bench, his silver hair neatly combed, his black robes pressed and formal. The judge's stern expression softened slightly as he nodded at Jim. "All rise," the bailiff called out as proceedings began. Jim stood with everyone else, then sat when instructed. He watched as Judge Bennett handled a few minor cases before his. The judge's movements seemed slower today, his normally sharp eyes slightly unfocused. Still, his voice rang clear as he called each case. "Walker custody matter," the clerk finally announced. Jim rose and approached the bench. The morning light streaming through the high windows felt suddenly too bright, too harsh. His palms grew damp as he clasped them behind his back, military straight. "Mr. Walker," Judge Bennett began, "regarding yesterday's temporary ruling." He paused, reaching for his water glass with an unsteady hand. Jim noticed beads of sweat forming on the judge's forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "Your Honor?" Jim took a step forward, concern creasing his brow. "Are you all right?" The judge's face had gone ashen. His hand trembled as he tried to lift the glass, water sloshing over its rim. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the wooden bench. Judge Bennett's words slurred. His right hand clutched at his chest, fingers curling into the black fabric of his robes. His eyes went wide with pain and fear. Time seemed to slow down. Jim watched in horror as the judge's body pitched forward, his forehead striking the bench before he slumped sideways in his chair. "Judge Bennett!" The cry came from multiple voices at once. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People jumped to their feet, voices rising in panic. The bailiff rushed forward, radio already in hand, calling for medical assistance. The clerk vaulted over her station, reaching the judge's side in seconds. "Clear the courtroom!" the bailiff shouted, his voice cutting through the growing noise. "Everyone out! Now!" People streamed toward the exits, their footsteps thundering against the floor. Jim stood rooted to the spot, his military training kicking in. Assess the situation, maintain order, help where needed. "Sir, you need to leave too," a young deputy said, touching Jim's elbow. Before Jim could move, the main doors burst open. Emergency medical technicians rushed in with their equipment, their shoes squeaking against the floor as they hurried to the judge's side. Their voices were clipped and professional as they began their assessment. Pulses irregular, blood pressure dropping. Jim backed away, giving them space to work. He watched as they efficiently transferred the judge onto a stretcher, an oxygen mask already strapped to his face. Judge Bennett's skin had taken on a grayish tinge that made Jim's chest tighten with worry. The medical team whisked the judge away, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the subtle hum of the air conditioning. Court officials huddled near the bench, speaking in urgent whispers. Papers lay scattered across the floor, forgotten in the chaos. Jim turned to leave, his mind already on calling Lily's school to check on her. A firm hand caught his arm. "Mr. Walker," the bailiff said quietly, his face grave. "A moment, please." Jim turned back, noting the unusual tension in the bailiff's normally impassive expression. Other court officials were looking their way now, their faces a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Before he lost consciousness," the bailiff continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "Judge Bennett managed to name you as his emergency replacement, effective immediately." The words hit Jim like a physical blow. He stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. Around him, whispers began to ripple through the remaining crowd, court staff, attorneys, and security personnel who hadn't yet left the room. "That's impossible," Jim managed to say, his throat dry. "I'm not even a lawyer." "It's within his authority for temporary appointments," the bailiff explained, still keeping his voice low. "He was very clear about it, said something about a man of integrity before he—" The bailiff trailed off, glancing toward the door where they'd taken the judge. Jim's mind raced. Yesterday, he'd been fighting just to keep custody of his daughter. Now, through some incomprehensible twist of fate, he was being asked to take the judge's seat? It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. The whispers around him grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the courthouse. He caught fragments of conversations. "The veteran from yesterday? Is that even legal? Judge Bennett chose him?" Jim stood in the center of it all, feeling as though the floor had dropped out from beneath his feet. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought of Lily, of his late wife, of Judge Bennett's collapsed form. The polished wood of the judge's bench seemed to loom before him, both a symbol of authority and a reminder of how far he was from his comfort zone. The bailiff still waited for his response, but Jim couldn't find the words. Through the windows, the morning sun continued to shine, oblivious to the upheaval below. In the distance, he could hear the fading sirens of the ambulance carrying Judge Bennett away, while all around him, the whispers grew and grew, filling the courtroom with a storm of speculation and disbelief. The bailiff's words hung in the air like smoke. Jim Walker stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Emergency replacement? Him? The same man who just yesterday had been humiliated in this very courtroom? "Sir?" The bailiff touched his elbow gently. "Please, this way." Jim's legs felt like lead as he followed the uniformed man. The wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the court proper seemed 100 feet tall. As he passed through the gate, whispers rippled through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. "That's the veteran from yesterday, the single father? Is this some kind of joke?" The judge's bench loomed before him, massive and imposing. Jim had only ever seen it from below, looking up. Now, with each step bringing him closer, his throat tightened. The leather chair seemed to dwarf everything around it. A court clerk appeared at his side, thrusting a stack of papers into his trembling hands. "These are today's cases, sir. Emergency protocols require immediate resumption of court proceedings." Jim glanced down at the documents, the words swimming before his eyes. His military training kicked in automatically. When overwhelmed, focus on breathing. In, out, in, out. A familiar face appeared beside him. Maria Alvarez, the public defender from yesterday, leaned in close. Her eyes were bright with determination. "You can do this," she whispered firmly. "Just be fair. That's all anyone needs right now." Jim nodded slightly, grateful for her presence. He looked out over the crowded courtroom. Anxious faces stared back at him. Defendants, lawyers, families. Regular people whose lives could be changed by what happened in this room, just like his had been, just yesterday. The bailiff cleared his throat. "All rise." The screech of chairs filled the room as everyone stood. Jim remained standing too, until Maria gently touched his arm. "You sit now," she murmured. "You're the judge." Lowering himself into the chair, Jim felt the cool leather against his back. The gavel sat before him, small but impossibly heavy with meaning. His hand shook slightly as he reached for it. The first rap of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom. Jim was surprised by how loud it was, how final it sounded. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Please be seated," he managed, the words coming out clearer than he'd expected. The rustle of movement filled the room as people sat down. A court clerk appeared at his elbow with the first case file. "Your Honor, we have Davidson versus City Transit Authority." Jim opened the file, conscious of every eye in the room watching him. An elderly woman in a wheelchair sat at the plaintiff's table, her attorney beside her. The city's lawyers clustered at the defense table, their suits expensive and expressions skeptical. "Proceed," Jim said, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. As the attorneys began their arguments, Jim found himself focusing on the elderly woman. She reminded him of his late wife's mother, the same dignity in her posture, despite obvious pain. He listened intently, asking questions when points needed clarification. The military had taught him to gather all necessary intelligence before making decisions. The morning proceeded in a blur of cases. With each one, Jim felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. But something else was building too. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he could do some good here. During a brief recess, Maria caught his eye from her position near the public defender's table. She gave him a subtle thumbs up, and Jim felt a flutter of confidence. He wasn't alone in this strange turn of events. The afternoon session dragged on, each case bringing its own complexities. Jim's head spun with legal terms and procedures, but he clung to one simple truth: treat everyone with the dignity they deserved. It was what he'd wanted yesterday, standing on the other side of that bench. Finally, as the sun began to set outside the tall courthouse windows, the bailiff called an end to the day's session. The room slowly emptied, leaving Jim alone with his thoughts and the enormous desk before him. He gathered his things slowly, his mind already turning to his next challenge. Explaining all this to Lily, how could he tell his 10-year-old daughter that her father, who yesterday had been fighting to keep custody of her, was now temporarily sitting as a judge? The drive home felt surreal. Traffic moved as usual along the familiar streets, but nothing felt normal anymore. Jim's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his wedding ring catching the last rays of sunlight. What would Sarah have thought of all this? He pulled into their modest driveway, spotting Lily's favorite backpack through Mrs. Rodriguez's front window next door. His daughter was in there, probably doing homework, having no idea how completely their world had just shifted. Jim sat in the car for a long moment, gathering his courage. The weight of the day pressed down on his shoulders, but beneath it was something else, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this strange twist of fate was more than just chance. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car. The walk to Mrs. Rodriguez's front door felt like another journey into unknown territory. But this time, instead of a gavel in his hand, he held only his heart and the hope that his daughter would understand. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Jim Walker stood at the stove, mechanically flipping pancakes while his mind raced with thoughts of the impossible task ahead. The familiar comfort of their morning routine felt different today, heavier, more significant. "Daddy, you're burning that one," Lily pointed out, her small finger directed at the smoking pancake on the griddle. Jim blinked, quickly scraping the blackened circle onto a separate plate. "Sorry, sweetie. I guess I'm a little distracted this morning." Lily tilted her head, her ponytail swaying. Is it about what happened at court yesterday? When the judge got sick? Jim turned off the stove and carried their plates to the table. The morning light caught the silver chain around Lily's neck, the one that had belonged to her mother. He took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would change everything. Actually, yes. There's something important I need to tell you. He settled into his chair, pushing aside his own barely touched breakfast. You remember Judge Bennett? Lily nodded, carefully cutting her pancake into neat triangles. The nice one who helped us? That's right. Well, he's very sick and needs time to get better. Jim paused, watching his daughter's face. And he asked me to take his place for a while. Lily's fork clattered against her plate. Her eyes grew wide, mouth dropping open in surprise. You mean you're going to be a judge? Temporarily, Jim quickly added. Just until they find someone permanent, or Judge Bennett gets better. But, Daddy! Lily jumped up from her chair, nearly knocking over her milk. That's amazing! You're going to be a real judge! She threw her arms around his neck, squeezing tight. Can I tell Miss Peterson? And Jamie? And everyone in class? Jim couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm, even as his stomach churned with anxiety. Well, I suppose you'll be the best judge ever, Lily declared, pulling back to look at him seriously. You always know what's right and fair. Remember when Tommy Wilson broke my crayon last year, and you made him apologize and give me his special sparkly one? Jim chuckled, remembering the playground mediation. That was a little different, sweetie. No, it's not. You listened to both of us and made everything okay. Lily's faith in him was absolute, shining in her eyes. Just like Mommy always said, you have a good heart. The mention of her mother made Jim's throat tight. He wished Sarah could see their daughter now, so grown up and wise beyond her years. Your mom was pretty smart about things like that. Lily nodded solemnly. She'd be super proud of you being a judge. She glanced at the clock and gasped. Daddy! We need to hurry! I have to tell everyone before the morning bell! Jim watched as she raced to grab her backpack, her excitement practically vibrating through their small house. His own fears seemed smaller in the face of her pure joy and confidence in him. Maybe that's what he needed, to see this through her eyes, not through the lens of his own doubts. The drive to school was filled with Lily's constant chatter about what judges do, peppered with questions about whether he'd get to use a real gavel and if he had to wear one of those fancy black dresses like on TV. It's called a robe, Jim corrected gently, navigating through the morning traffic. And, yes, I suppose I'll have to wear one. You'll look so important. Lily bounced in her seat. Can I come watch sometimes? Jim glanced at her in the rearview mirror. We'll see, sweetheart. Most of it would be pretty boring for you. Nothing you do is boring, Daddy. They pulled up to the school drop-off line, and Lily was unbuckling her seatbelt before the car fully stopped. She leaned forward to kiss his cheek. Show them how special you are, okay? I'll do my best, Princess. Jim watched as she practically skipped toward the school entrance, her backpack bouncing with each step. Several of her friends immediately surrounded her, and he could see her animated gestures as she shared her big news. The pride in her voice echoed in his mind as he drove toward the courthouse. My daddy's a judge now. Such simple words, but they carried the weight of responsibility he couldn't ignore. Parking in the judicial lot felt wrong, like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone facade more imposing than ever. As he climbed the steps, he noticed the subtle changes in how people looked at him, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. In the main hallway, a cluster of lawyers stood near the coffee cart, their conversations dropping to whispers as he passed. He caught fragments of their words. Temporary solution. Completely unqualified. What was Bennett thinking? Jim straightened his tie, feeling the ghost of yesterday's humiliation trying to creep back. But then he remembered Lily's unwavering faith, her absolute certainty that he could do this. He thought of Sarah, who had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. A familiar voice cut through his thoughts. Your Honor. Jim turned to see Maria, the public defender from yesterday, holding out a thick folder. Her use of the title made everything suddenly real. The morning docket, she explained, her expression encouraging. You ready for this? Jim took the folder, thinking of Lily's words. You always know what's right and fair. He nodded, squaring his shoulders. Let's find out. Jim Walker adjusted his tie for the 10th time that morning, sitting behind the massive oak bench that now felt like a mountain on his shoulders. The courtroom stretched before him, its familiar worn wooden pews now viewed from an entirely different angle. The American flag hung quietly in the corner, its presence both comforting and intimidating. Case number 2374, Matthews versus Johnson, the clerk announced, her voice steady and practiced. Jim's hands felt clammy as he opened the case file. Mrs. Matthews, an elderly landlord in a pressed blue suit, sat at one table. At the other, Mr. Johnson hunched in a wrinkled work shirt, dark circles under his eyes and calloused hands clasped tightly together. Your Honor, Mrs. Matthews' lawyer began, his voice smooth as silk. My client has been more than patient. 3 months of unpaid rent cannot be ignored. We're requesting immediate eviction. Jim nodded slowly, remembering Maria's whispered words about fairness. He turned to Mr. Johnson, who had no lawyer beside him. Would you like to explain your situation, sir? Johnson stood, his work boots scuffing against the floor. Yes, Your Honor. I lost my job at the factory when they downsized. Been working 2 part-time jobs since then, but my daughter got sick. His voice cracked. The medical bills. I had to choose between rent and her medicine. The courtroom remained silent, but Jim noticed a few heads nodding in the gallery. He recognized that look, the same desperate determination he'd seen in his fellow veterans' eyes when times got tough. Mrs. Matthews, Jim addressed the landlord directly. How long has Mr. Johnson been your tenant? 5 years, Your Honor, she replied stiffly. Always paid on time until recently. Jim studied the papers before him, then looked at both parties. His heart thumped against his chest, but his voice remained steady. Mr. Johnson, what is your plan moving forward? I started a new job last week, Your Honor. Better pay, steady hours. I can catch up on the payments with a little time. Johnson pulled out some papers from his worn briefcase. I have proof of employment here. The bailiff brought the documents to Jim. They were genuine, a full-time position with benefits at a local manufacturing plant. Mrs. Matthews' lawyer stood again. Your Honor, while this is all very touching, the law is clear about the law, Jim interrupted quietly, is also clear about reasonable accommodation and good faith efforts. He remembered the times he'd struggled after his wife's passing, how a little understanding had made all the difference. Here's my ruling, Jim continued, his voice growing stronger. Mr. Johnson will pay this month's rent in full, plus 10% of the back rent each month until the debt is cleared. He'll provide Mrs. Matthews with copies of his pay stubs to verify income. He looked at both parties. This arrangement continues as long as all current rent is paid on time. If Mr. Johnson misses a payment, Mrs. Matthews can reinstate eviction proceedings immediately. The lawyer opened his mouth to object, but Mrs. Matthews touched his arm. She was looking at Johnson with softer eyes now. That seems fair, Your Honor. Johnson's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down. Court costs will be split between both parties, Jim concluded, lifting the gavel. The sound of it striking the wooden block echoed through the room with finality. As people filed out, Jim noticed the quiet murmurs, the thoughtful expressions. A court officer nodded approvingly as he passed. Maria, watching from the back, gave him a small smile. Outside the courthouse steps later that afternoon, Jim loosened his tie, exhausted but relieved. His first real case as judge, he'd survived. Judge Walker? A voice called out. A small group had gathered near the bottom of the steps. He recognized a woman who'd been sitting in the gallery during the Johnson case. She wore an Army veteran's cap. Sir, we just wanted to say thank you, she said, gesturing to the others. A single father with 2 young children, an elderly man in a wheelchair with a Marine Corps pin on his jacket, and a few others. It's good to see someone up there who understands what it's like down here. Jim felt his throat tighten. I'd just try to be fair, he managed. That's exactly what we need, the single father said, his kids nodding vigorously beside him. As they dispersed, Jim stood for a moment in the warm afternoon Sunday. People were watching, hoping, expecting. The weight of their trust felt even heavier than the judge's robe had. But for the first time since taking the bench, he felt something else too, purpose. He headed to his car, knowing Lily would be waiting at home, ready to hear all about her daddy's first day as a real judge. The courthouse cast long shadows across the parking lot, but somehow they didn't seem as daunting anymore. The clock on Jim's kitchen wall ticked past 9 as he sorted through the day's mail. His shoulders ached from sitting ramrod straight in the judge's chair all afternoon. The small pile of envelopes seemed innocent enough until he reached the last one. No return address, just his name scrawled in harsh black ink. Inside, the message was brief but clear. "Stay in your lane, soldier boy. The courthouse isn't your battlefield." The paper trembled slightly in his hands. A soft knock at the back door made him jump. Maria Alvarez stood there, her usual confident demeanor replaced by worry lines around her eyes. Jim quickly let her in. "I saw your light on," she said, keeping her voice low. "I had to warn you. There's talk in the courthouse. The old guard isn't happy." Jim gestured to the anonymous letter on the table. Maria picked it up, her lips pressing into a thin line as she read. "Just as I feared," she said, placing the letter back down. "Listen, Jim, these people, they've had things their way for years. A temp judge who actually cares about justice? That's not part of their plan." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the shadows deeper. Through the hallway, Jim could see Lily's bedroom door slightly ajar, her nightlight casting a gentle glow. The sight of it strengthened his resolve. "What exactly are we dealing with here, Maria?" She pulled out a chair, sitting down with the weighted movement of someone carrying a heavy truth. "Kickbacks from certain landlords, favorable rulings for campaign donors. Nothing outright illegal enough to prove easily, but..." She spread her hands. "The system works for them, not the people who need it most." Jim ran a hand over his face, feeling the day's stubble. "That's why the previous judge picked me, isn't it? He knew?" Maria nodded slowly. "Judge Thompson was one of the good ones, but even he could only do so much when he had his heart attack." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think he saw a chance to shake things up." Another envelope slid under the front door with a soft whisper against the hardwood. Jim's heart rate kicked up as he retrieved it. This one contained a photo. Lily at her school playground, taken earlier that day. On the back, 2 words. "Think carefully." The surge of protective anger that rose in Jim's chest pushed away any fear. He showed the photo to Maria, whose face darkened. "Cowards," she spat. "Using a child to threaten you." "I served 3 tours," Jim said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath. "Saw good men die defending what's right. I won't let these courthouse bullies scare me away from doing the same." Maria touched his arm gently.
"Jim, no one would blame you for stepping down. Your daughter..."
"Is exactly why I can't." He looked toward Lily's room again. "What kind of example would I be setting if I taught her to back down from bullies? If I showed her that doing the right thing only matters when it's easy?" The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the walls like searching fingers. "They'll come at you hard," Maria warned. "These people have connections, money, influence." Jim thought of the morning's case, the elderly tenant he protected from eviction, the grateful tears in her eyes. And what do we have? The truth, some loyal courthouse staff, a few journalists who might listen. Maria straightened her shoulders. "And me, you're not in this alone, Jim." After Maria left, Jim double-checked all the locks and windows. He moved through the house like he used to clear buildings overseas, methodical, alert. But this wasn't a foreign battlefield. This was his home, where his daughter should feel safe. He paused in Lily's doorway. She slept peacefully, her stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm, dark hair spilling across her pillow. The sight of her innocent face made his decision clear. Running away wouldn't protect her. It would only teach her that the bad guys win. Jim settled into the armchair near her bed, the one where he used to sit when she had nightmares after her mother died. The threatening letters sat heavy in his pocket, but his heart felt lighter. He knew what he had to do. "Lord," he whispered into the quiet room, "I don't ask for much. Just give me the strength to do what's right. To be the father Lily needs. To be the judge these people deserve." He closed his eyes, remembering his wife's favorite saying, "Character is what you do when no one applauds." The night stretched on, but Jim kept his vigil. Whatever came next, he would face it standing tall, for justice, for his daughter, for all the people who needed someone to fight for them. In the gentle darkness of Lily's room, his whispered prayer continued, asking not for safety or easy victories, but for the courage to stay true to what he believed in. The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed gallery. Jim Walker adjusted his black robe, still not quite used to its weight after these few weeks. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people squeezed into every available seat. Workers in worn jackets sat shoulder to shoulder with reporters clutching notepads, while photographers jostled for position near the walls. At the plaintiff's table sat Marcus Johnson, a factory worker of 20 years, his weathered hands clasped tightly in front of him. Behind him, dozens of his co-workers filled 3 rows, their faces a mix of hope and worry. The factory's high-powered legal team occupied the defense table, their expensive suits a stark contrast to the workers' clothes. Jim took a deep breath and called the court to order. The familiar rap of the gavel brought sudden silence. "In the matter of Johnson versus Riverside Manufacturing," he began, his voice steady and clear, "regarding allegations of systematic racial discrimination in hiring and promotion practices." As the attorneys presented their cases, Jim listened intently. The defense painted a picture of a successful company with merit-based policies. But the evidence told a different story. Qualified workers repeatedly passed over, separate break rooms that somehow still existed in the 21st century, and promotion patterns that couldn't be explained by chance. Marcus Johnson's testimony cut through the legal jargon with simple truth. "I trained 5 different supervisors," he said quietly. "Each time they told me I wasn't ready for promotion myself, but I was ready enough to teach others how to do the job." Jim noticed Maria Alvarez in the back of the courtroom, watching carefully. She had helped prepare some of the workers' testimonies, though another attorney was handling the case. Her presence reminded him of their conversation about justice being more than just following procedures. During the defense's cross-examination, one of the company lawyers tried to suggest Johnson was creating problems where none existed. Jim saw Marcus's teenage son in the gallery clench his fists, saw the pain flash across the faces of other workers. "Counsel," Jim interrupted, his voice firm, "please restrict your questions to the facts of the case." As final arguments concluded, Jim called for a brief recess. In his chambers, he looked at the folded flag on his desk, the one he'd brought from home. He thought about honor, about the oath he'd taken both as a soldier and now as a judge. The choice became crystal clear. Returning to the bench, Jim sat straight and tall. The room fell silent, every eye fixed upon him. He began speaking, his words measured but carrying the weight of conviction. "This court has heard compelling evidence of systematic discrimination at Riverside Manufacturing. We've seen documentation of qualified workers denied advancement based not on their abilities, but on the color of their skin. We've heard testimony describing separate facilities and unequal treatment that harken back to darker days in our nation's history." Jim paused, looking directly at the company executives. "In America, we hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. This isn't just a lofty ideal, it's the law of our land. When we fail to uphold this principle, we fail not just as a business or a community, but as human beings." His voice grew stronger, filling the courtroom. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Riverside Manufacturing will implement immediate changes to its hiring and promotion practices under court supervision. The company will provide back pay to affected workers and establish a review board to prevent future discrimination. Furthermore, I am ordering sensitivity training for all management personnel." Jim turned his attention to Marcus Johnson and the other workers. "Your courage in coming forward has shown that justice isn't just a word written in law books. It's something we must actively pursue and protect. Every person deserves to be judged by their character and capabilities. Nothing more and nothing less." As he finished speaking, the courtroom erupted in applause. People stood, cheering and hugging each other. Marcus Johnson wiped tears from his eyes as his son embraced him. Even some of the reporters were clapping. Through the crowd, Jim spotted Maria beaming at him from the back of the room. She gave him a small nod that spoke volumes about their shared belief in what justice could really mean. The day's proceedings concluded, and Jim gathered his papers, his heart full but his mind already turning to his next cases. As he stepped out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun, a familiar voice called out, "Daddy! Daddy!" Lily came running down the courthouse steps, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her neighbor Sarah, who often watched her after school, followed at a more dignified pace. Jim caught his daughter in his arms. lifting her high as she squealed with delight. "Daddy, I heard what happened." Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Tommy's dad was there, and he called Mom right away, and she told everyone at the school pickup line. You're a hero." Jim hugged her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I just did what was right, sweetheart. That's what makes you a hero," Lily said with absolute certainty, wrapping her arms around his neck. Jim's alarm buzzed at 6 a.m. as usual, but his hand froze halfway to silencing it. Through bleary eyes, his phone screen displayed a flood of message notifications. His stomach tightened as he opened the first one, a link to the local news website. The bold headline hit him like a physical blow. "Unfit Judge, Veterans Past Exposed." Below it, his service photo stared back at him, alongside sensational quotes about unstable behavior and questionable judgment. Jim sat up slowly, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the article. They had taken fragments of his military record and twisted them into something ugly. A difficult mission where he'd had to make split-second decisions was portrayed as reckless endangerment. His combat stress counseling after losing squad members was spun as mental instability. "No," he whispered, recognizing the calculated manipulation. That's not how it happened. In the kitchen, he couldn't bring himself to make breakfast. The coffee pot sat cold and empty while he stared at more news alerts popping up on his phone. Each one seemed worse than the last. Local TV stations were picking up the story. Social media was already alive with cruel comments and judgment. "Daddy?" Lily appeared in her school clothes, backpack ready.
Are you okay?
Jim forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Just running a little late today." He quickly made her a peanut butter sandwich, trying to hide how his hands shook. "Here's your lunch. Have a great day at school." She hugged him tight before leaving, and he held on a moment longer than usual, drawing strength from her innocent trust in him. The drive to work was a blur. Every traffic light felt like an eternity as his mind raced through the implications. Would they try to remove him from the bench? Would this affect his custody of Lily? The courthouse steps seemed steeper than ever. Inside, conversations stopped as he passed. Whispers followed in his wake. Even the security guards, who'd grown friendly over the past weeks, avoided his eyes. In his chambers, more bad news waited. A formal complaint had been filed, questioning his fitness to serve. The courthouse administration wanted an emergency meeting. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with reporters seeking comments. Mid-morning, his secretary knocked softly. "Judge Walker, your daughter's school is calling." Jim's heart dropped. "Put them through." "Mr. Walker," the school counselor's voice was gentle but concerned. "There's been an incident. Lily's quite upset. Some children were, repeating things they'd heard from their parents about you." He closed his eyes, pain stabbing through his chest. "I'll come get her." When he arrived at the school office, Lily sat hunched in a chair, tear tracks on her face. She looked so small, so vulnerable. The sight of her broke something inside him. "Baby, what happened?" He knelt beside her. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Tommy said you're not a real judge. He said his dad told him you're crazy from the war and you hurt people." Fresh tears spilled over. "I told him he was lying, but then other kids started saying it too. They said we don't belong here." Jim gathered her into his arms, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Other parents in the office turned away, some with sympathy, others with obvious disapproval. The drive home was quiet. Lily stared out the window, occasionally sniffling. Jim's mind raced, trying to figure out how to explain things to her, how to protect her from this ugliness. At home, he made her favorite mac and cheese for lunch, but she just pushed it around her plate. "Daddy," her voice was small. "Are the bad things they're saying true?" "No, sweetheart." He sat beside her. "Sometimes people take good things and twist them to look bad. Remember when you drew that beautiful picture and Tommy said it looked like scribbles? It's like that, but worse." "But why would they do that?" Jim struggled to find words a child could understand. Some people don't like it when things change. They don't like seeing someone different in charge, even if that person is trying to do good things. She nodded slowly, processing this. "I'm still proud of you, Daddy." Those simple words nearly undid him. He helped her get ready for bed early, knowing she was emotionally exhausted. As he tucked her in, she clutched her stuffed rabbit tight. "Will it be better tomorrow?" "I hope so, baby," He kissed her forehead. Try to sleep now. Downstairs in the dark living room, Jim slumped onto the couch. The house felt heavy with silence. On the mantel, his wife's photo smiled at him, and beside it, the folded flag from her funeral caught the dim streetlight through the window. The day's events crashed over him. The headlines, the whispers, Lily's tears. Everything he'd built, everything he'd tried to do right seemed to be crumbling. Maybe they're right, he whispered into the darkness. Maybe I can't do this. His words hung in the empty room, heavy with defeat. The clock ticked softly, counting down to another day he wasn't sure he could face. The courthouse janitor nodded to Jim as he slipped through the darkened hallway. Evening, Judge Walker. His voice held no mockery, just simple respect that made Jim's chest ache even more. Thanks, Pete. I just need a moment alone in there. Jim's voice sounded hollow even to himself. Take all the time you need, sir. I'll be down the hall if you need anything. The massive wooden doors creaked as Jim pushed them open. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the empty benches. His footsteps echoed in the vast silence as he walked down the center aisle, past where hundreds had sat during his rulings over the past weeks. The judge's bench loomed before him, somehow both familiar and foreign now. Jim ran his fingers along the polished wood, remembering the first time he'd sat there, terrified but determined. Now, the sight of it made his stomach churn. The morning's newspaper lay crumpled on the desk where he'd left it. Walker's War Crimes, the truth behind our temporary judge. The accusations were carefully crafted lies, twisting his combat experiences into something unrecognizable. But the damage was done. Jim sank into one of the front row seats, his head in his hands. Lily's tear-stained face flashed in his mind. How she'd run into his arms after school, sobbing about the cruel things her classmates had said. They said you hurt people, Daddy. They said you're bad. The weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders. He tried so hard to build something good here, to make decisions that helped people. To make Lily proud. To honor Sarah's memory. Sarah. His chest tightened as he thought of his late wife. The memory of her came rushing back. A sunny afternoon in their backyard. Shortly before her illness took her. She'd been hanging laundry while he worried about a difficult situation at work. Character isn't what you do when everyone's watching and cheering, she'd said, pinning up one of Lily's small dresses. It's what you do when no one applauds, when they mock you, when doing the right thing costs you everything. Jim stood slowly, walking up the steps to the judge's bench. The chair seemed to mock him now. Who was he to think he could do this? A broken soldier, a widowed father, barely keeping his own life together. The whispers in the hallways echoed in his mind. Unqualified, unstable, unworthy. Sarah's voice came back to him again, from a different memory. The night before a dangerous deployment, when he'd confessed his fears of not being good enough, strong enough, she'd taken his face in her hands, her eyes fierce with conviction. James Walker, you listen to me. Your strength isn't in your uniform or your rank or what other people think of you. It's in here. She'd pressed her hand against his heart. God put it there, and no one can take it away unless you let them. The moonlight shifted, casting the judge's bench in a soft glow. Jim remembered the cases he'd heard here. The struggling single mother fighting eviction. The elderly veteran seeking medical benefits. The young man facing discrimination at work. He'd listened to them all, treated them with dignity, made decisions based on justice rather than influence. Was I wrong, Sarah? He whispered to the empty room. Was I fooling myself thinking I could make a difference here? The silence seemed to pulse with memories. Lily's proud smile when she'd told her friends about his new role. The quiet thanks from people who finally felt heard in this courtroom. Maria's fierce belief in his integrity. But now the newspapers painted him as a monster, and the power brokers wanted him gone. Jim's legs felt heavy as he climbed the final steps to the bench. The judge's chair stood silent, waiting. He touched the gavel, the symbol of authority that had somehow been entrusted to him. The weight of responsibility, of justice, of truth pressed down until his knees buckled. He knelt there, behind the bench where he'd tried to serve with honor, and the tears he'd been holding back finally came. Lord, he whispered, his voice breaking in the darkness. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this fight. Show me the way. Please, show me the way. His prayer echoed in the empty courtroom, a soldier's plea for guidance, a father's cry for strength, a man's desperate search for truth in the face of lies. Outside, the city continued its nighttime rhythm, unaware of the battle being waged in one man's heart beneath the moonlight streaming through the courthouse windows. The empty courtroom's silence wrapped around Jim like a heavy blanket as he remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against the smooth wooden bench. The moonlight filtering through the high windows cast long shadows across the floor, making the room feel both sacred and lonely. The sharp click of hurried footsteps echoing through the hallway barely registered in his mind. But then the double doors burst open with a bang that made him jump to his feet, his military instincts still sharp despite his exhaustion.
Jim, thank God you're still here.
Maria Alvarez rushed in, her usually neat appearance disheveled, clutching a thick manila envelope to her chest. Her dark hair had escaped its professional bun, and her eyes blazed with an intensity that made Jim straighten his shoulders. Maria, what are you doing here so late? She strode down the center aisle, her heels clicking against the marble floor. I've been working non-stop since those headlines broke. I knew something wasn't right. She slapped the envelope onto the judge's bench. And I was right. Jim watched as she pulled out document after document, spreading them across the surface where he usually presided. His throat tightened at the sight of his name scattered across the papers. Look at these emails, Maria pointed, her finger trembling with barely contained anger. Between Judge Harrison and Commissioner Brooks, they've been planning this for weeks, ever since you ruled against that factory owner who's apparently Harrison's golf buddy. Jim leaned forward, squinting at the printed emails. The words seemed to swim before his tired eyes, but certain phrases jumped out. Need to discredit Walker. Dig up anything from his service record. Can't have some bleeding heart veteran. Undermining the system. They twisted everything, Maria continued, her voice cracking with emotion. That incident in Afghanistan? The one they're using to paint you as unstable? I found the original report. She pulled out another document. You saved your entire unit that day, Jim. You received a commendation. But they conveniently left that part out. Jim's hands trembled as he picked up the paper. The memory of that day flooded back. The heat. The dust. The split-second decisions that had haunted him for years. But seeing the official record, the truth laid bare. Something shifted in his chest. There's more, Maria said, pulling out financial records. Harrison's been accepting kickbacks for years. That's why he's so desperate to stop you. Your rulings? They're threatening their whole corrupt network. Jim sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the evidence before him. All this time, he whispered. You've been doing exactly what a judge should do, Maria finished for him. Being fair, showing mercy when it's needed, making decisions based on justice, not favors. She planted her hands on the bench and leaned forward. That's why they're scared of you, Jim. He thought of Lily's tears earlier that day, of the shame in her eyes when she'd told him about the kids at school. I was ready to resign, he admitted quietly, to protect her. Maria's expression softened. And what would that teach her? To run when things get hard? To let the bullies win? She reached across the bench and grabbed his hand. The Jim Walker I've seen in this courtroom these past weeks, he's exactly what this community needs. A man who understands struggle, who knows what it means to fight for what's right. Jim stood slowly, looking around the empty courtroom. In the dim light, he could almost see the faces of all the people who'd stood before him. The single mother fighting eviction, the elderly veteran seeking health care, the factory workers demanding dignity. He'd given them all a fair hearing, just as he'd wished someone had done for him when he'd first walked in here, humiliated and afraid. If you resign, Maria said softly, they win. And everyone who started to hope again because of you, they lose. Jim picked up one of the emails, reading the contemptuous words about his service again. But this time, instead of shame, he felt something else stirring in his chest. Determination. He thought of his late wife's words about character, about doing what's right when no one's watching. But sometimes, he realized, character meant standing up when everyone was watching. They're counting on me being too broken to fight back, he said, his voice growing stronger. Too scared of losing what little I have left. Maria nodded, gathering the documents back into the envelope. They don't understand what kind of man they're dealing with. A soldier who never left anyone behind. A father who'd move mountains for his daughter. She held out the envelope. The question is, are you that man, or are you going to let them win? Jim looked at the envelope, remembering the weight of his daughter's arms around his neck, the trust in her eyes when she called him her hero. He thought of all the other daughters and sons out there, watching their parents struggle against a system that seemed stacked against them. His hand was steady as he reached for the envelope. Maria's eyes lit up with fierce approval as he took it, and she reached across the bench to clasp his other hand. "Then we fight," Jim said, his voice firm and clear in the moonlit courtroom. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Jim Walker stood before a growing crowd. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the simple wooden podium someone had brought outside. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and coffee from the cafe across the street. He glanced down at his worn leather shoes, the same ones he'd worn when he'd first entered this courthouse as a desperate father. Now, dozens of faces looked up at him expectantly. Veterans in their service caps, single mothers holding their children's hands, elderly couples who'd watched the whole drama unfold from their regular morning walks past the courthouse. "I'm not much for speeches," Jim began, his voice quiet but steady. "In the military, they taught us to let our actions speak louder than words." He paused, meeting the eyes of fellow veterans who nodded in understanding. "But today, I need to speak up." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the courthouse square. Jim spotted Maria standing at the edge of the crowd, giving him an encouraging nod. The weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on his shoulders. The false accusations, the whispered doubts, the tears in Lily's eyes when she'd heard the cruel words at school. "Some of you know me as the veteran who became a temporary judge. Others know me as the single father who fought to keep his daughter." His voice grew stronger. "But what you might not know is that I never wanted any of this. I didn't ask to be a judge. I just wanted to raise my little girl in peace and do right by my late wife's memory." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "When they attacked my character," Jim continued, "they didn't just hurt me. They hurt every veteran who struggled to build a new life. They hurt every single parent who's fought to keep their family together. They hurt every person who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice." A man in a wheelchair, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, called out, "We're with you, Walker!" Jim's throat tightened with emotion. I could stand here and defend my military record. I could explain every twisted lie they've spread about me. But that's not why I'm here. He straightened his shoulders. I'm here because this courthouse belongs to all of us. Justice isn't just for the powerful or the privileged. It's for everyone. More voices joined in with words of support. Jim saw a young mother holding her toddler, tears streaming down her face. She looked so much like the tenant he'd helped in one of his first cases. "Someone wise once told me that character is what you do when no one's applauding." Jim's voice softened as he remembered his wife's words. "Well, I've seen real character in this community. I've seen it in the single mother working 3 jobs to keep her kids in school. I've seen it in the veteran helping other vets navigate the system. I've seen it in every person who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard." The crowd had grown larger now, with courthouse employees and passing citizens stopping to listen. Jim noticed several familiar faces from his court sessions, people whose cases he'd heard, whose stories he'd witnessed. "I'm not perfect," he admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm just a father trying to do right by his daughter. But if serving as judge has taught me anything, it's that justice needs defenders. Not just in the courtroom, but in our everyday lives." A group of veterans raised their fists in solidarity. Someone started chanting, "Walker! Walker!" The sound echoed off the courthouse walls, growing stronger as more voices joined in. Jim raised his hands, humbled by the response. "Please," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't about me. It's about something bigger. It's about standing together against corruption. It's about believing that one person's dignity matters. It's about showing our children that truth still means something in this world." The chanting died down, replaced by attentive silence. Jim could feel the energy of the crowd, the shared determination in their faces. "Whatever happens next," he continued, "I want you to know this. I'll keep fighting, not just for my position or my reputation, but for every person who walks through those courthouse doors seeking justice, because that's what my wife would have wanted. That's what my daughter deserves. And that's what this community needs." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans stood at attention, offering sharp salutes. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders. The courthouse steps filled with applause and cheers. Walker! 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 The chant grew stronger, more unified. Jim stood quietly at the podium, overwhelmed by the show of support. He saw Maria beaming from her spot in the crowd, clutching the evidence files to her chest. He saw courthouse staff who'd once whispered behind his back now joining in the chants. But most importantly, he saw hope in the faces before him. Hope that maybe, just maybe, one person standing up for what's right could make a difference. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming his face as the chants of his name echoed across the courthouse square, carrying with them the promise of justice yet to come. Jim gripped the podium tighter, drawing strength from the crowd's energy. The tide was turning, not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The chants grew louder, more insistent, filling the morning air with their unified voice. Walker! 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 The courtroom buzzed with tension as people packed the wooden benches, shoulder to shoulder. Late morning light filtered through tall windows, casting shadow patterns across the floor. Jim Walker sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight but relaxed. A stark contrast to the rigid anxiety of the court officials lined up opposite him. Maria Alvarez stood beside Jim, her dark hair pulled back neatly, manila folders stacked precisely before her. Her usual fire was contained, but her eyes sparkled with determination. She placed a reassuring hand on Jim's shoulder. The acting chief judge, an elderly man named Harrison, called the session to order. The bang of his gavel echoed through the suddenly silent room. This hearing will now commence regarding the allegations against Judge James Walker and the subsequent investigation. Jim rose slowly, his military bearing evident in every movement. He spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Your Honor, I stand before you not to defend my reputation, but to defend the integrity of this court. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. Among the spectators, Jim spotted several familiar faces, veterans he'd ruled fairly for. Single parents who'd found justice in his courtroom, community members who'd witnessed his dedication to fairness. Before Miss Alvarez presents her findings, Jim continued, I want to say something. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. When I first stood in this courtroom months ago, I was a broken man. But this court gave me a chance to serve again, to help others find justice. That sacred duty means everything to me. Maria stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Your Honor, we have evidence that will expose a coordinated campaign to discredit Judge Walker. She lifted the first folder. These documents show a pattern of corruption that goes back years. She began methodically presenting her evidence. Email exchanges appeared on the courtroom's projection screen, showing courthouse officials plotting to remove Jim. Bank statements revealed suspicious transfers. Phone records displayed calls between key conspirators. Notice the timing, Maria pointed out, highlighting dates on the screen. These attacks on Judge Walker's character began precisely when he ruled against powerful interests in the discrimination case. A gasp rippled through the courtroom as Maria revealed a particularly damning email from Bernard Knox, the court administrator. It explicitly detailed plans to fabricate stories about Jim's military service. Knox, sitting among the accused officials, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face had grown increasingly pale as each piece of evidence mounted against him. Furthermore, Maria continued, her voice gaining strength, we have sworn statements from 3 courthouse employees. She gestured to a group near the back, who stood briefly. They witnessed Mr. Knox and others deliberately manipulating case assignments and threatening staff who questioned their actions. Jim remained composed throughout the presentation, his eyes steady, his expression thoughtful. When Knox's lawyer attempted to interrupt with objections, Jim simply waited patiently for the chief judge to rule. Your Honor, Jim finally said, rising again, I could speak about my military record, about my dedication as a father, about my commitment to justice. But instead I'll say this. Every person who comes through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness. That's what I tried to do. That's all I ever wanted to do. The chief judge leaned forward, his expression grave. Mr. Knox and other accused parties, do you have any response to these allegations? Knox stood, his expensive suit suddenly seeming too large for his shrinking frame. Your Honor, I... We. He glanced at his colleagues, then at his lawyer, who shook his head slightly. No comment at this time. The chief judge's face hardened. Bailiff, please take Mr. Knox and his associates into custody pending formal charges. He turned to Jim. Judge Walker, this court owes you an apology. Your appointment is hereby confirmed, permanently. The bailiff moved forward with several deputies. They began escorting Knox and the other officials toward the door. Knox's shoulders slumped, his head bowed low. The other conspirators shuffled along, their faces masks of shame and defeat. As the last official disappeared through the heavy wooden doors, the courtroom erupted. Applause thundered off the walls. People jumped to their feet, cheering and hugging each other. Some were crying, others laughing with joy. Maria turned to Jim, tears in her eyes, and pulled him into a quick hug. Justice prevails, she whispered. The sound of celebration filled every corner of the majestic old courtroom, washing away the last shadows of doubt and corruption in waves of joy and vindication. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Inside the main chamber, the mood was electric as the Judicial Committee prepared to cast their votes. Jim Walker sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, watching as each member took their turn at the microphone. Based on the evidence presented and Judge Walker's exemplary service during this interim period, announced the committee chair, her voice clear and steady, we will now proceed with the confirmation vote. Jim's heart thundered in his chest as the votes were cast one by one. He thought of Lily, probably sitting anxiously at their neighbor Mrs. Peterson's house, waiting for news. The memory of her brave smile this morning gave him strength. By a vote of 11-2, the chair declared, this committee confirms James Walker as permanent judge of the 5th District Court. The chamber erupted in applause. Maria, sitting in the front row, beamed at him with tears in her eyes. Veterans and community members who had supported him through the darkest days stood and cheered. Someone started chanting his name, and soon the whole room joined in. Jim rose slowly, overwhelmed by the moment. He raised his hand, and the room fell silent. Thank you, he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. I promise to serve with integrity and compassion, to remember that every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity and fair treatment. He paused, swallowing hard. But right now, there's someone I need to see. Outside the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed like bees, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Judge Walker, how does it feel? What's your response to the corruption scandal? Any comment on your unprecedented appointment? Jim raised both hands, gently but firmly, waving them off. No comments today, folks. I need to get home to my daughter. The crowd parted reluctantly, and Jim hurried to his car. As he drove through familiar streets, memories washed over him. That first terrifying morning in court when he'd been mocked and humiliated. The sudden collapse of Judge Bennett. The weight of responsibility thrust upon him. The bitter taste of betrayal during the smear campaign. But through it all, there had been Lily's unwavering faith in him. He pulled into their driveway, noticing Mrs. Peterson's curtains twitch next door. Before he could even reach for his keys, the front door flew open. Lily stood there, her backpack still on, clearly having rushed home from school. Daddy, she cried, launching herself down the porch steps and into his arms. Jim caught her, spinning her around once before setting her down. Hey, sweetheart, Mrs. Peterson saw it on the news. Lily's words tumbled out in excitement. She said you're staying as judge forever now. Is it true? Jim knelt down to her level, looking into eyes so much like her mother's. That's right, honey. The committee voted today. I'm going to keep trying to help people, just like we talked about. Lily's face grew serious. She reached out and straightened his tie, just as she'd seen her mother do countless times before. I knew you could do it, Daddy. Even when those mean people said bad things, I knew they were wrong. They walked inside together, Lily chattering about how her teacher had let the class watch the news coverage during lunch period. In the kitchen, Jim found a congratulations card propped on the counter. Mrs. Peterson's handiwork, no doubt. Wait here, Lily said suddenly, darting up to her room. She returned, clutching something behind her back. What have you got there, sweetie? Lily pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper. I made this in art class last week. I was saving it for when you won. She handed it to him proudly. Jim unfolded the paper carefully. It was a crayon drawing of him in his judge's robes, standing tall behind the bench. Below, in Lily's careful handwriting, were the words, "My daddy helps people find justice." His vision blurred with tears as he stared at the simple artwork. Lily stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Mommy would be proud of you," she whispered against his chest. The dam broke. Jim sank to his knees, gathering his daughter close as tears rolled freely down his cheeks. He thought of Sarah, his beloved wife, who had always believed in him even when he doubted himself, who had made him promise to be strong for Lily, who had taught him that true strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting back up. Lily's small hands patted his back as he wept, her own tears dampening his shirt. They held each other in the quiet kitchen, father and daughter, their bond stronger than ever through all they'd weathered together. In that moment, Jim felt Sarah's presence so strongly it took his breath away. He could almost hear her voice. "See? I told you were stronger than you knew." He pulled back slightly, cupping Lily's face in his hands. "Your mom would be proud of you too, sweetheart. So proud of how brave and kind you've been through everything. Can we put my picture up next to Mommy's flag?" Lily asked, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Jim nodded, unable to speak. Together they walked to the shelf where Sarah's folded flag sat in its triangular case. With trembling fingers, Jim pinned Lily's drawing next to it. Past and present, loss and hope, all connected by love and courage. Lily leaned against him, her head resting on his arm. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, baby girl," Jim whispered, holding her close. "More than anything in this world." Monday morning dawned with a gentle warmth that seemed to wrap the courthouse in a golden embrace. Jim Walker stood before his bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting his judge's robe. The black fabric no longer felt foreign or heavy on his shoulders. It had become a symbol of the journey that had brought him here. "Ready for breakfast, Daddy?" Lily called from the kitchen. She had insisted on making toast for him this morning, a small gesture that made his heart swell. "Coming, sweetheart," he replied, giving himself one final look. The man in the mirror stood straighter now, carried himself with quiet confidence rather than the defeated slouch of months past. In the kitchen, Lily had set out 2 plates with slightly burnt toast and jam. "I tried to make it perfect," she said, frowning at the darker edges. Jim took a big bite and smiled. "It's exactly how I like it, honey. Thank you." They shared a peaceful breakfast together, the morning light streaming through their small kitchen window, making the worn tablecloth look almost new. As Jim drove to the courthouse, he noticed how different everything looked compared to that first terrifying day when he'd arrived as a defendant. The same stone steps that had once seemed to loom over him now felt welcoming. The morning air carried the scent of blooming spring flowers from the courthouse garden, where the groundskeeper waved cheerfully as Jim passed. Inside, the marble halls echoed with the start of a new day. Sarah, one of the court clerks who had initially doubted him, greeted him with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Judge Walker. Your first session starts in 30 minutes. "Thank you, Sarah," Jim replied, noting how she now said his title with respect rather than skepticism. Several citizens waiting in the hallway nodded and smiled as he passed. An elderly veteran stood and saluted, which Jim returned with dignity. A young mother holding a toddler whispered something to her child about him being the judge who listens. In his chambers, Jim reviewed the day's docket while sipping coffee from his favorite mug, a Father's Day gift from Lily with "World's Best Dad" written in wobbly letters. Maria knocked and entered, carrying a stack of files. "Ready for another week of making this place better?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with the shared memory of their victory over corruption. "One case at a time," Jim replied, the phrase having become something of a personal motto. As the clock struck 9, Jim made his way to the courtroom. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise! The Honorable Judge James Walker presiding." Jim entered and took his place at the bench, looking out over the packed courtroom. The same space that had once witnessed his humiliation now radiated with purpose and hope. Familiar faces filled the gallery. Community members who had stood by him, veterans who had rallied to his defense, families whose cases he had heard with compassion. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, catching the American flag's stars and stripes in its gentle glow. Jim remembered the folded flag on his shelf at home, his wife's flag, and felt her presence with him. "Please be seated," he said, his voice carrying naturally now, no longer trembling with uncertainty. The rustle of people settling in filled the air, followed by an attentive silence. Jim looked down at his first case of the day, a custody dispute not unlike the one that had brought him here months ago. The parents sat at their respective tables, looking nervous but hopeful. They had specifically requested his courtroom, he knew, because word had spread about his fairness and understanding. "We're here today," he began, his tone warm but firm, "to find the best path forward for a child who deserves all the love and support we can provide." He saw both parents relax slightly at his words, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who truly cared about justice. The morning session proceeded smoothly, with Jim handling each case with the perfect balance of authority and compassion that had become his trademark. During a brief recess, he overheard a young lawyer telling his client, "Don't worry, Judge Walker always makes sure everyone gets a fair hearing." The day passed quickly, filled with the important work of helping people find resolution and justice. As the afternoon session wound down, Jim looked out over his courtroom one final time. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows. But unlike the shadows of his past, these were peaceful, marking the end of another day of purpose. That evening, Jim arrived home to find Lily had already set the table for dinner. She had placed a small vase with wildflowers in the center, flowers she'd picked herself from their tiny backyard garden. "How was court today, Daddy?" she asked, as they sat down to their simple meal of spaghetti and meatballs. "Good, honey. Really good." Jim twirled pasta onto his fork, watching his daughter's face beam with pride. The kitchen was filled with the warm glow of sunset, painting their modest home in shades of gold and amber. The light caught Lily's hair, reminding Jim so much of her mother that his heart ached with love and gratitude. "We're safe now, Daddy," Lily said suddenly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Jim felt tears well up in his eyes as he nodded, squeezing her small hand in his. The setting sun streamed through their kitchen window, warming them both in its gentle embrace. Their small table, their simple meal, their quiet home. It was everything. In this moment, as father and daughter sat together in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve, Jim knew they had finally found their way home. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jim Walker, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.